International Development. Thank you for being with us today and for being in this conversation that that is very important for us, for the work that we do and for the projection also that we have in the work ahead after the pandemic. The idea of this webinar, my name is, by the way, my name is Nicoletta Dentico, and I am the person in charge of the Global Health Justice Program of Society for International Development. I'm speaking to you from Rome, where several of the colleagues and even one of the panelists is today, actually two panelists. One is with us at the office of SID, and Ruchi is also in Rome. The idea of the webinar today, of this webinar, is to actually relaunch and refreshen a bit topics and considerations that we have facilitated as a SID in one issue of our development journal that you can see here. It was published in December 2020. Where we were actually looking at addressing the healthy commons that the world needs after this pandemic, and the reasons, looking at the root causes of the pandemic, therefore looking at COVID-19 more in its kind of syndemic causes, meaning the idea of looking at COVID-19 as a major collapse of the globalization that we all experience, that we are in, and which has created this kind of asphyxia, this kind of impossibility to breathe. So in the various articles, the various important contributions that the journal produced at the end of 2020, we believe that there are many aspects that are still extremely important, extremely vital, and that we really need to bring them up in the discussion around the pandemic. As we see it develop today, after 1.5 years, there seems to be a rather, a rather strong projection towards health security and also biomedical solutions, whereas, of course, we need to look at the broader perspective. This is a moment of intersecting crises, and we should not lose the other crises beyond the health crisis that is that we are still pretty much crossing. We have decided to entitle this webinar "The Vaccine of Biodiversity," because everybody, of course, talks about vaccines, and legitimately so, since vaccines are the instruments to fight epidemics. However, I think time has come to really wonder whether this obsessive concentration on the biomedical solutions is enough at this stage. And we also wonder whether the fact that we only talk about the pharmaceutical vaccines may kind of be a sign that we have not yet understood the crisis that we are in, that after 1.5 years, we are just looking at one aspect, but we are not looking at the root causes of this emergency. And also we are not learning from the very important lessons that COVID-19 has taught humankind and the world. So that's what we want to do today. That's what we want to really engage in with our very important panelists. We are here with some of the authors of the contributions for the Development Journal, but we are also here with some of the people that we have bumped into during our continuous research for, voices and analyses that are useful to understand the current situation. And one of them is Maria Cristina Rulli from the Politecnico of Milano. She's not, strictly speaking, an author of any contributions in the development journal, but she has been working on a very important research that we shall hear about later, but not with her, because Maria Cristina Rulli, unfortunately, Professor Rulli doesn't feel well at all. And so we have another person intervening, another person that has contributed to the research on her behalf. So I think we can start from this piece of poetry that has been produced by an Italian poet, Mariangela Gualtieri. Quote, "Without bees and worms, life does not hold. But without us, now we know, everything proceeds." So I think it is also with this attitude of humility that we need to start this conversation, immunizing ourselves from this typical neoliberal arrogance that makes us think completely, ready to face any crisis. And with this kind of thinking in our mind, I should like to give the floor immediately to Ruchi Shroff, the director of Navdanya International. But before doing that, I think, yes, thank you, Marisol. I think we need to clear some of the house rules that, as you can see, we open the chat windows to see important informations and engage. If there are any questions or comments, let's use the feature of the chat box. And also we are recording this meeting, and messages can be sent through the chat for reference. Of course, I ask everybody to mute himself or herself when not speaking, because so this will allow us to avoid background noises that are not pleasant or undue in the economy of the conversation. So thanking you all again for being with us. Ruchi, you now have you have the floor, you have your 10 minutes to enlighten us about the vaccine of biodiversity. Please.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta, and thank you, SID, for inviting us, for inviting me to speak on this very important and timely topic, especially now, where we are seeing an intense contest emerging between two paradigms of health, of science. One is a paradigm of health, as you very rightly reminded us about the humility in these precarious times, one paradigm that sees the interconnections between planetary health and human health, and the other which looks at health only as a commodity that we buy from pharmaceutical industry, or as you put, only the biomedical vaccines. And in this view, we see ourselves as separate from nature, as those that can control, can predict nature, but also manipulate nature without any thought of consequences. But at the same time, in no moment has the importance of these connections become more apparent than in this seemingly unending pandemic and the repercussions around it, because it has exposed the extent and the interconnected precarities of all our global systems, and has shown how the health emergency we are facing is deeply connected to the health emergency the Earth is facing in terms of the steady environmental degradation, the extinction and disappearances of species, and the climate emergency as we see today. And biodiversity sits at the heart of all of these challenges. We know it provides clean air, water, rejuvenates soil fertility, allows niche for multiple species, and provides a variety of food for plants, for animals, for humans. All of these functions which render ecosystems healthy, but also resilient to sudden climate changes and disease outbreaks. And all of these overlapping factors have a direct and tangible tie to human health as a continuum. from the biodiversity in our forests to our biodiversity on our farms, in our soil, through microorganisms, plants, seeds, food, our diets, to our gut. Thus, the health becoming a continuum from the earth to our bodies, with biodiversity at its core. And we also know that people and diverse cultures across the world have eaten a variety of plants and animals. And what agricultural and nutritional systems from all over the world have in common is, in a way, different ways and expressions and awareness of the values of natural balances, and a strong culture of conservation and regeneration for the survival of the present and future generations. Farmers and peasants have historically developed countless farming techniques, hundreds and thousands of varieties of species, and built up an extraordinary reservoir of biodiversity. And it is this evolutionary interaction between man and nature that has led to this participatory selection of food biodiversity and a celebration of the knowledge of ecosystem management. So it is this resilience and the longevity of this approach of safeguarding biodiversity that has given us a healthy planet. Having said that, despite the widespread recognition and the importance of biodiversity and calls to curb the sixth mass extinction, not a single goal of the Convention of Biological Diversity's Aichi biodiversity targets have been met for the second consecutive decade. In fact, biodiversity loss has been made worse as no action has been taken to curb either pesticide use or pollution or fossil fuels, or land use change such as deforestation for industrial agricultural expansion. For example, between 2015 and 2020, 10 million hectares were globally of forests were cut down, with the biggest driver being conversion to industrial agricultural land use for soy and palm oil plantations. And now the latest study says that the Amazon now is becoming a source for carbon rather than a sink, much to the disappointment of carbon offsetters. And thus, regardless of the international recognition and the importance and the need of biodiversity, one of the key threats remains the active promotion of the global industrial food system, which will be talked about in greater detail. But we know that it is a system that has not only degraded the environment through greenhouse gas production, it is one of the key contributors to climate change. It has led to a depletion of soil, biome and biodiversity thanks to the use of monocultures and pesticides. It has led to soil erosion, water depletion, and hundreds of thousands of the farmers and plant varieties and land races that have existed for generations have now been substituted by a small number of modern, highly uniform commercial varieties, which has led to a further loss of agrobiodiversity and further reduced the capacity of present and future generations to predict environmental degradation as well as disease outbreaks. So, and considering if we look at disease, we use the worst of the industrial agricultural crops to feed industrially farmed animals. It creates a huge potential risk for a rise in newer zoonotic diseases. And thus, as forests are destroyed, as farms become monocultures to produce nutritionally empty commodities, diets become degraded, we are ironically becoming connected through disease rather than through diversity. So it is a model, the economic as well as the food system model, which is not only destroying the Earth's capacity to create, maintain, and regenerate living processes, but it has precarity on all ends of the food system through degraded health, through industrial diets, or through the loss of access to biodiverse foods and ecological resilience. And if we go further, we now have the same big ag, big tech, big pharma, the holy, unholy alliance coming to give us a cure of the diseases that they created using the new language of nature-based solutions, half for the earth, or climate smart, thus deepening this instrumentalization of nature as false solution. And one of the places we are seeing this imposition is the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit, which doesn't question, of course, the mentality and the predatory logic of industrial global food systems, but instead, most of the solutions are designed to be applied within the same model, following the same assumptions that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with our existing models, and thus making worse, sidelining the real root solutions, sidelining food sovereignty, human rights, rights of peasants, of indigenous people, and nature's rights. So it is an imperative that we move from this hijacked food systems transformation proposed by the likes of the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit into a holistic and integrated response, and bring us back into an alignment with an agroecological and biodiversity-based paradigm. This means farming in nature's way, as co-creators, as co-producers with diversity, respecting nature's ecological cycles, respecting people's rights. It is based on recognizing that the web of life is a food web, and maintaining that should be the first objective of agriculture. Food that is ecologically produced, democratically distributed, contributing to the health of the planet and the people. It is based on a diversity of knowledge systems, including knowledge within living systems. It is based on diversity of food economies, from the local to the regional to the planetary. It is based on democracy. And when we practice this agriculture in harmony with Earth's ecological processes, we evolve an agriculture of care for the land and for the soil. And it is thus an active participation in the process of regenerating seed and biodiversity, soil and water. But this also means that the paradigm shift recognizes that biodiversity has more than just nutritional or economic significance. For instance, the exchange of farmer seeds is not just the exchange of pieces of genetic information or mere nutrients. The free exchange of seed embodies a worldview which holds reverence for the continuity of life. The farmer herself is a custodian for the diversity to be passed on. And this free exchange of knowledge ensures the survival and the long-term resiliency of not just the variety, the species, and the knowledge, but also the culture and community. So if you see, many ancient cultures have plants, flowers, seeds, and foods that are considered sacred or are given religious significance. For instance, in India, plants such as paddy, coconut, millets, cardamom are used as auspicious offerings. Seeds are worshipped before planting or before consumption, and this symbolizes the community's intimacy with nature. And thus it goes much beyond mere nutrition, but into a different worldview of deep intimacy with the land. And this is the worldview that holds respect for the diversity of all life. And finally, we see that all over the world, small farmers and gardeners, locally and regionally, are already practicing this ecological and democratic path. And they are thus preserving their soils and their seeds and creating resilience in the face of ecological and economic collapse. So we have two futures in front of us. One road that is leading to the collapse of planet's ecosystems, creating diseases and socioeconomic systems, and the other that is leading to that can lead to the regeneration of our planet, our soils, our biodiversity, our health, farmers' livelihoods, our democracy. And our future and the future of all the diverse species depends on which road we take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. Thank you for this very enlightening kickoff of the conversation. You mentioned the continuum of health, the value of natural balances, this dual presence of conservation and regeneration, this question of the evolutionary interaction between human and nature that has been lost and needs to be recovered, because the alternative is the collapse of the ecosystem. And finally, I very much appreciated your aligning planet, soil, health, and democracy, because you will never have the former ones without the latter one. Democracy is the, instrumental approach to secure that people's dignities and planet dignity are both respected. So very much, I think you contributed to bring us really in medias res, as we can say, right at the middle of the conversations, the challenges and also the responsibilities that we all have also as activists. And because you mentioned, of course, the food systems and all the implications of the current industrial agriculture, I would start then I would pass on the floor to Hernando Salcedo Fidalgo. He is the representative of FIAN in Colombia. He's a doctor, so he embodies this duality of health, and because he cares very much for food and for agriculture. Hernando, therefore, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Nicoletta. Gracias al CID por esta invitación. Voy a hablar en español porque va a ser mucho más franca la posibilidad de transmisión de mi mensaje. Fuera de agradecer, quiero decir que soy parte de FIAN Colombia, de la línea de nutrición en FIAN Colombia, y que nosotros somos una organización y personas que estamos por fuera del conflicto de interés en todo lo que hacemos en torno a la alimentación y la salud. Lo segundo es que quiero retomar algunos elementos para avanzar en la redefinición de los sistemas alimentarios. Lo que ha mencionado en el título Nicoletta, que es muy sugestivo, nos invita a pensar que el tema de la vacunación es una mirada reduccionista basada en un modelo de conocimientos, en un paradigma único, que es un modelo biopositivista, medicalizado, que pierde de vista la interacción entre los contextos naturales, humanos, universales, planetarios, y eso es muy importante tenerlo en cuenta. Y a esa evocación del título me referiré también al final. Quiero decir también que sobre la sindemia que ha introducido Nicoletta, en realidad desde el punto de vista de nuestra mirada en FIAN Colombia, la sindemia es una convergencia, una coexistencia de múltiples determinantes, entre los cuales puedo mencionar tres desde nuestro punto de vista, y uno es la epidemia de la obesidad, la expansión del fenómeno de la malnutrición a nivel global y el colapso climático. Estos tres elementos tienen un hilo común que nos permite, obviamente, hacer una crítica incluso a la definición de sistemas alimentarios. Quiero comenzar por ahí. Esta aparición hacia el 2016 del grupo de alto nivel de expertos con el lanzamiento de la definición de sistemas alimentarios ha puesto sobre el tapete algo que parecía integrar muchos conceptos, pero que en realidad es también un reduccionismo. Es decir, nos reduce a una sola mirada el problema alimentario. Desde FIAN queremos proponer hablar de proceso alimentario y no de sistemas alimentarios. Y en realidad sistemas alimentarios, en plural para el grupo de alto nivel de expertos de la FAO, es en realidad la mirada desde un solo sistema, que es el agroindustrial. Y entonces, si miramos este problema como proceso alimentario, tendremos otras entradas para mirarlo desde diversos puntos de vista. Lo segundo es que desde el punto de vista epidemiológico, sabemos hoy en esta pandemia con absoluta claridad que las poblaciones con mayor riesgo, no solamente de enfermar, sino de ser hospitalizadas y de morir, son las poblaciones que padecen enfermedades crónicas no transmisibles. Eso quiere decir que el vínculo que parece invisible es absolutamente evidente entre proceso alimentario, problema de malnutrición y el perfil epidemiológico que hace más susceptibles a las poblaciones de morir, enfermar y padecer estas enfermedades crónicas no transmisibles. Esto es fundamental para entender entonces que en otro nivel, ya no epidemiológico, sino en el nivel de la biodiversidad, este sistema alimentario agroindustrial tiene un impacto de tal nivel sobre la diversidad que además es el vehículo de fenómenos como la zoonosis. Las zoonosis son justamente ese salto de una especie a otra, de la reaparición de las enfermedades infecciosas que creíamos estaban atrás y que en la fragilidad de los ecosistemas y en la pérdida de la biodiversidad es en el espacio ideal en el cual aparece la zoonosis. Incluso si nuestra hipótesis es que esta enfermedad viral proviene de una síntesis de laboratorio, incluso esa es una zoonosis. Las zoonosis debilitan en todas sus formas la biodiversidad y los ecosistemas. En tercer lugar, hay que mencionar que esto es el resultado de un proceso de globalización en el cual en un tiempo muy corto hemos producido cambios tan importantes como aquellos que podrían ocurrir durante una era geológica, por ejemplo. Por eso adherimos al concepto de antropoceno, no desde el punto de vista académico para ver si sí es tan justo o no, sino para entender que los cambios que hemos hecho en 2 siglos de industrialización, de globalización y de capitalismo desenfrenado han implicado el estatus en términos de impacto sobre la naturaleza, los ecosistemas, la biodiversidad y la especie humana allí dentro de tal dimensión que allí está el caldo de cultivo para que se produzcan pandemias como la que estamos viviendo y las que vendrían después. Si no nos ocupamos de estas razones estructurales ahora y perdemos de vista en la focalización y en el reduccionismo de la perspectiva vacunal, no vamos a ver las verdaderas causas de este proceso. Aquí hay causas estructurales. Quiero poner en cuarto lugar un ejemplo muy importante que es aquello que ocurre con las semillas transgénicas, con los transgénicos, que es intervenir el material genético para no solo patentar un material genético que proviene de la naturaleza, sino para utilizar esa condición del transgénico en un circuito que está relacionado con la industria farmacéutica y con la de los pesticidas. Es un poco lo mismo lo que está ocurriendo con la posibilidad de decir no tiene nada que nos ocupemos de vacunas producidas genéticamente que abren además la puerta a las terapias génicas en los humanos y que tienen el mismo nivel de equivalencia del transgénico en su aplicabilidad. Y en cambio la pregunta es decir, ¿por qué no nos ocupamos de restaurar, pero como dijo Ruchi, de un proceso de regeneración del daño a la naturaleza y a la biodiversidad? Esa es la gran pregunta. En este proceso alimentario hay objetivos que deberíamos tener de manera estructural ahora. Uno, el de recuperar la posibilidad de la alimentación como bien común. Quizás otros van a hablar de ello, pero quiero referirme ahora porque incluso desde el punto de vista epidemiológico es importante. Ya lo he dicho antes. Segundo, el desprendimiento del antropocentrismo, algo ha dicho Ruchi también, pero en el sentido de, a través de ese proceso de regeneración, lograr producir un cambio del antropoceno y del capitaloceno en medio de esta única mirada de los sistemas alimentarios para abrir la posibilidad hacia la agroecología y hacia verdaderos sistemas alimentarios ligados a las comunidades con otra relación frente a la naturaleza y a los propios conocimientos. Por supuesto, aquí hay que decir que la cumbre de sistemas alimentarios que se organiza está absolutamente capturada por esa única mirada, que es una captura corporativa completa del sistema de Naciones Unidas. El modelo de multiactores es un modelo de captura corporativa en donde los únicos actores son aquellos que están haciendo los negocios, tanto en la industria del agro como en la industria farmacéutica, como en la industria de la salud. Entonces aquí tenemos un problema de cómo construir colectivamente una alianza común para una biosis distinta y ir en contravía de justamente la única mirada que está proponiendo esta cumbre del sistema alimentario, lo diría yo así. Nuestra vacuna más útil es la regeneración con miras a restaurar la biodiversidad y a construir salud planetaria, porque ese es el enlace con la salud humana. Hasta ahí intervendría yo. Gracias, Nicoletta, y gracias, amigas y amigos.
Muchas gracias a usted, Hernando. Yes, thank you very much. The real vaccine we need is this planetary regeneration. It seems a very clear message that you are conveying. And I also think it's important for all of you to know that this webinar is a kind of starter of the the global mobilization that is structuring and will be implemented in the coming days of a counter summit, una controcumbre, digamos. It's a counter summit to this UN summit that is really designed according to the multi-stakeholder model. That is the model of those that actually do business, as you correctly said, Hernando, and that is extremely worrisome for the line of responsibility of who rules the world. I think another very important issue you mentioned is which we will need to recover and re-elaborate in our conversation is nutrition as a common good, which is a value in itself, but it also has an important epidemiological value, because it both helps, people's health to avoid obesity, to avoid chronic and non-transmissible diseases. It also helps the epidemiology of the planet, to cure the planet, to really, remedy the many devastations produced. And talking about devastations and talking about the risks, the future risks for the planet, I would like to introduce and thanking again Hernando Salcedo Fidalgo, who has written his contribution for the development journal that I invite you all to, open and read. I would now like to move to Milan. I would like to move to a little image where I see two people, actually Professor Rulli, despite the fact that she's not well, she is with us, but the floor will be to Nicolas Galli, who has participated with Professor Rulli to this very important research that was published, I think last May in Nature, yes, on the 31st of May in Nature Food. I bumped into this article because I just stopped immediately, because the research conducted by Professor Rulli is really to start digging into a quantitative analysis of the nexus between the ongoing indiscriminate land use and the emerging of zoonotic diseases. I think this is a gap that this research published on Nature Food, and that is also, of course, it's a link that we are circulating, allows us to really start understanding the dynamics of the increasing resurgence of zoonotic events. Of course, spillovers are not a novelty. They have always happened, but precisely as Hernando was saying, that in such a short time we have determined such a great dramatic changes. The spillover effects are now coming. And since the beginning of the new millennium, we have seen, of course, SARS in 2002. Then we've seen avian flu, swine flu, we've seen MERS, we've seen Zika, we've seen Ebola. And now we see, the question of SARS-CoV-2. Of course, it's not only coronaviruses, but coronaviruses have been pretty much the protagonists of this sequence of zoonotic events since year 2000. And therefore, I think it's very important to understand if we have new tools, if we have new equipment to understand and map the risk and also prevent the new risks. So I really would like now to give the floor to Nicolas Galli with the assistance and the presence also of Professor Rulli, whom I really thank for being here, notwithstanding her bad state of health today. Thank you, Nicolas, you have the floor.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen since I have some maps to show, but it says I am not.
Nicholas, we don't hear you extremely well, so
I
please,
can't
if
hear
you
you.
can just
So
come
probably
closer to the microphone, please.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I was saying, yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. I was trying to share my screen, but I'm not able to. So maybe we can do it from
Sorry, just give me a second. Marisol, if you can make them co-hosts, then they'll be able to share the screen. Thank you.
Okay, now I think I can. Yes, great. Okay. Bit slow. Oh, okay. So yes, as has been already said, we made a study which was published in Nature Food on the nexus between land use change and livestock evolution and the emergence of zoonotic diseases, in particular coronaviruses. So let me start from something we all know. We know that population has been rising for the last decades and is set to continue doing so. So we are more than 7 billion, almost 8 billion people today, and will be almost 10 by 2050. And we've seen that most of the growth is happening in Southeast Asia, so China, India, and neighboring countries. We also know that population is not only growing, but is getting richer. So, and we know that wealthier people require more food, but not only more food, but also more protein food, which consumes even more natural resources. How do we do that? So how do we supply for this additional demand of food by using land? We, as has been said before, we engage in land use change, which includes deforestation, but also forest fragmentation, which we will see is a bit different because the main difference between plain deforestation and forest fragmentation is the more direct destruction of the habitat that is associated with a transformation of the forest in small patches that happens with forest fragmentation. And all this with the aim of agricultural expansion, so to produce more crops to feed more people, but also intensive livestock production, so to produce more meat. We are generating also unhealthy environments for livestock animals, but also to just make room for more people, so generating new space for settlement, encroaching into wildlife habitats. This plus more particular ecological mechanism, that is the one by which species that tend to be host of zoonosis of viruses or bacteria tend to be also the same species that adapt the best to disturbed habitats, because the two things are correlated. If I have a faster metabolism and a faster life cycle, I am more able to host viruses, but I am also more able to adapt to disturbed environments. So this is the mechanism by which the environmental degradation is correlated to zoonotic spillover, but it's a quite complex mechanism. So how can we quantify this mechanism to individuate risk areas and potential risk areas, and why are these risk areas what they are? We try to put the marks into it. We chose an area of more or less 30 square kilometers, 30 million square kilometers, which corresponds to the range of horseshoe beds that are the type of beds that are known to carry coronaviruses. On this area, we sampled 10,000 different locations, randomly, but accounting for the presence of more species of horseshoe beds. Around these locations, we made a 30-kilometer radius buffer, and within this buffer, we sampled a set of different data representing different risk factors. So the presence or absence of forests, croplands, of livestock animals of different species, of people and of settlements, and in particular forest fragmentation. So we classified forests, where we had forests between unfragmented patches. Yes?
Sorry, Nicholas, I have to interrupt you because the quality of your voice is really very difficult, not only to listen to, but I guess also to translate. So I really invite you to consider that we need either to raise your voice, to get closer to the microphone, to do something, because it's very, very difficult to follow you.
Okay.
And that's a pity.
Try and scream and go slower, maybe it helps.
Maybe using handsets will, I mean, headphones, maybe it helps.
Okay, yeah, we're getting some. Okay.
Sorry, but I really would like people to understand what you're saying, and you know, and your voice should properly accompany the slides that you have prepared. So it's a pity if we cannot hear you. And I think interpreters also have a difficulty in really translating what you are saying. Sorry for intruding.
Yeah, sure. I can restart from, oh, thank you so much. Do I go on from here? Okay. Better?
If you speak, it's better, because better without speaking.
You're right, yes. Okay, I shall try and go on from here.
Raise your voice, please, a little bit.
Okay. So I was saying, on this very big area, so 13 million square kilometers, which is the range where we find horseshoe beds, we sampled a number of locations and tried to measure risk factors as the absence, the presence, absence of forest, its fragmentation, the presence of cropland, livestock, people, and their settlements. So different factors require multivariate testing to understand whether they contribute singularly or altogether to zoonotic risk. So we used two techniques mostly, a hotspot, cold spot analysis, which we used to find spatial groups of locations having very high or very low values of some of the indicators. This is very useful because it treats the different factors all in the same way. So we become able to see the composite effect of different factors altogether. The second analysis is a multivariate spatial cluster analysis, which combines the different factors even before grouping them. So it's better in individuating smaller groups with more particular characteristics. So we have seen, like, for example, here, the red patches are those where forest fragmentation is particularly high. And we will see in the next maps that some areas have hotspots for different variables and some do not. So for example, livestock has hotspots in Asia, but also in small parts of Europe, depending on the animal you consider, of course, because different cultures farm different animals. And settlements are present where, of course, big clusters of human population are present. What we have seen is that combining all these three different risk factors, so animals, humans, and fragmentation of nature, we see that we have a big red patch in China, but also some other patches in Southeast Asia, and something in Europe, little ones. Clusters, this is the result of the grouping analysis. As I was saying, this is good because it helps finding small groups with very peculiar characteristics. So it automatically focuses on the areas where concurrence of risk factors is particularly intense. It's where I have to look. So there is the final classification. What we also tried to do was for areas that are not hotspot yet, to see if they could become one if we keep doing what we have been doing. So if some of these, if one or more than one of these risk factors increase. And besides some interesting areas in Europe, what we have seen with, that is pretty relevant is, for example, in Southeast Asia, all the areas that are, let's say, a buffer zone between areas that are already hotspots and areas that are not hotspots yet tend to become a hotspot in response to one or the other factor. So this says us that these big hotspots in multivariate hotspots tend to expand if we keep increasing settlements, or if we keep increasing fragmentation, or if we keep increasing intensive livestock production, depending on the zone. So we have to make some disclaimers, let's say. So we focused on the distal factors, so on the root risk factors rather than on the proximal drivers. So on factors that create the environment in which the likelihood of shortening the distance between humans and wildlife hosts of zoonotic pathogens can become shorter. So we did not focus on everything that happens after the spillover, because we wanted to see what environmental drivers can increase the spillover risk. Of course, once a spillover happens, the spread of this disease depends on a range of other factors that include characteristics of the virus itself, so its persistence, its contagiousness, and so on, and on the public response, of course. Another thing we need to clarify is that we do not prove a causation. There is not a causal chain in this work, but we see that areas where the distance between humans and wildlife hosts becomes shorter, so where it is more likely to get into contact with zoonotic pathogens, are the same areas where we have a co-occurrence of these risk factors I've talked about today. Other two things, we focused on bats and coronaviruses. Of course, it could be interesting to investigate also other zoonotic families. And we also focused on present data. So another thing that would be interesting to see is what is the effect on climate change. So connecting to that, what's next? Concerning policy for areas identified as hotspots, what we need to do is to increase surveillance, to increase biosecurity, so to reverse this trend that increases connections between habitat destruction and zoonotic risk. For areas that are potential hotspots, so the areas we have seen that are no hotspots yet, but could become one if we increase risk factors, what we can do still is identify which is the risk factor for this area and try to mitigate it. Why is this important? Because as we have seen, as was also said before, risk factors that have an effect on zoonotic risk are also the factors that contribute to environmental degradation and climate change and so on. So interventions aimed at reducing the risk of spillover may have multisectorial positive outcomes because they could also help contain environmental degradation. Concerning further research, as I was saying before, two important things are investigating the effect of climate change, because it may change the distribution of zoonotic hosts, but also the transmission mechanism, and investigate other zoonotic families. So zoonotic families for which we know that the livestock species are intermediate hosts, so they play a role in going from wildlife to humans, but also vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, and so on, because these have a stricter connection to climate and weather factors. So what we really need is transdisciplinarity. We need to work together as environmental scientists, as health experts, as epidemiologic experts, as ecologists, to more correctly quantify these composite risks. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Thank you. I think you have perfectly represented with your PowerPoint with the images what Ruchi was telling us at the very beginning. And also, you know, since hotspotting is being enhanced, and this actually your work gives us a perfect representation of the outputs of globalization, okay, and also how the fact of having transformed China into the global producer for the world, and China's decision to outsource its production to countries where they can even more exploit people and nature. It really presents the situation in a very impactful way. It makes me think of a NASA video that was talking about global warming anomalies in 2018, which represented in 33 seconds of, you know, simply showing how the world is on fire because of the globalization mechanisms and because of the exploitation without control of nature, how we are really creating this dystopic situation of risking, as Ruchi was saying, of producing an entire collapse of the ecosystems. So COVID is actually telling us that this is the scenario. It teaches us, we all knew it before, but COVID is actually coming to tell us that this is a really serious question. So we really need to change route. And thank you again, therefore, and thank you for this very important work, which I hope will continue on other, you know, in other areas, because health and nature, as we know very well, is all very, very connected. I would now like to give the floor to Stephen Healy. Stephen Healy is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at the Western Sydney University. Stephen Healy has, for the purpose of the work on the journal, on the development journal, has brought together an amazing group of people working and telling us about how planetary food commons can be created, shaped, designed, even implemented, and how we can think about a post-capitalist, post-COVID food futures. I was particularly thrilled by the work done and the article written here, because it, of course, contains a very strong analytical background, but also the cases, the splinters of hopes of those communities that are already learning from the lessons of COVID-19 and implementing the futures that we want to see. So that's why I really cared so much for Stephen and his team to be in this call. I'm also particularly happy because you know, we have this intergenerational kind of involvement in this conversation, which I think is very important. So it is well into the night in Australia. I deeply appreciate your efforts, Stephen and Inka, and I give you the floor. And welcome to this call.
Thanks very much for the warm introduction. Can you confirm that my voice is coming through?
Yes, it is. Speak a bit louder, but yes, okay. It is.
All right, I do have a 3-year-old asleep, so hopefully
yes,
I won't
exactly.
speak
I imagine.
so loud that I wake him up. All right, so is my slideshow There, that should work. So fellow panelists, conveners, and members of the Society for International Development and honored guests, it's a real pleasure to join you this afternoon in Rome. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Guringai and Darug peoples, who have had a sustained relationship with this land just north of Sydney for generation upon generation. My co-presenter Inka Santala and I are sharing our time, and my role is to set up the context for our main argument, which really resonates with the first presenter, Ruchi, that food, the knowledge and cultural practices and skill it takes to produce it, the means for its distribution, the custodianship of the water, air, and earth that's required for its cultivation, are better conceived of as a set of intertwined commons. What we refer to here as the planetary food commons is something that is both global in scale, but also expressed in the particularity of place, and that conserving its diversity in place is critical for our shared survival. But to better understand where we're coming from, this requires a bit of context. So Inka and I and our four co-authors are part of a global network of scholars, artists, and activists known as the Community Economies Research Network. This is a feature of our website. A central proposition of CERN scholarship is that the dominant conception of economy, that of capitalist firms employing wage labor to produce goods and services for the market, is merely the tip of an economic iceberg, and that economies in countries in the global north and global south are intrinsically diverse, what's represented below the waterline, all of those various spaces, practices, and relationships that we find ourselves in every day where we meet our needs. And I think a few things follow from this. One, economies are embedded in other domains of difference in ecologies and culture, what our anthropologist Arturo Escobar calls the context of the pluriverse. Second, that this diversity means that capitalist business as usual is not the only game in town. And third, that economies become spaces where we can renegotiate terms, even identify and inhabit common forms of life that acknowledge our interdependence with one another and the more than human world. These ideas informed a sustained conversation between members of our collective in relation to the pandemic. Around this time last year, we were talking about this topic, which became the basis for our paper. And part of what we were responding to was sociologist Bruno Latour's observation in the opening days of the pandemic that COVID had hit the pause button on business as usual, stopping the unstoppable globalization machine and opening what Gayatri Spivak called a portal that leads to a different future. So we began thinking about how the pandemic created a context where food systems in each of our respective countries were responding to the pandemic crisis, and how these responses in turn might serve as the beginning of a transitional process towards more just and equitable ways of dealing with climate change, another threat to food security. The metaphor of the iceberg suggests that economic diversity is life below the waterline, but it's submerged in a world where both champion and critic alike are fixated on capitalism. D'Souza Santos describes the same phenomenon in a slightly different way through the concept of the sociology of absence, that describes how forms of life, webs of relations, including the food web, have been made invisible, made to disappear, or rendered insensible. I'm reminded here as well of Aboriginal historian Bruce Pascoe's explorations of the colonial letters and records from the early days of settlement in Australia, where colonists noted the extensive agricultural practices of Aboriginal inhabitants, and in the next sentence they would simply erase their existence, asserting that Australia is terra nullius. So things can be disappeared. And it's in this context of erasure that the COVID pandemic has laid bare both what's broken about business in business as usual, and also what else is already here, but is unacknowledged. We've learned from the profusion of books like Marta Citron and the Sembrar Collective's Pandemic Solidarity, or Dean Spade's treatment of mutual aid, that there are all sorts of community-based responses to the pandemic ongoing where people are getting their needs met. These things only appear to us as spontaneous because our eyes have been trained to ignore it. That is to say, they are hidden in plain sight. The pandemic does, however, offer us an opportunity to think about how practices of mutuality are made possible, what they allow us to do, and what's required to sustain them. How, in other words, mutuality can be made to endure through time. And it's here, I think, that the concept of the commons becomes important. So one of the devices that we've developed is what colleagues and I have termed the commons identikit. The identikit shifts focus from the commons as a thing, a resource, to a social process that negotiates the terms in which commons are accessed and used, for whose benefits, and where the responsibility of care lies. This shift from commons to commoning allows us to see the boundaries that separate commons, private property, and unmanaged open access resources can be renegotiated. What's unmanaged can be made common in whole or in part. So for instance, the attempt to care for the atmosphere on a planetary scale is a primary example of that. What is currently private property can be made common in whole or in part. How we access the things that allow us to nourish, sustain, or protect ourselves that can be shared more widely. What this foregrounds is a more than capitalist politics of commoning. And in relation to food, the questions that we found ourselves asking were, how can food and food systems be extended for the common good? What can we learn from one another about how to respond to the pandemic? And how can this response to this emergency inform a more sustained response to climate change? With the full complement of our co-authors, what we found was a remarkable range of ways that food systems were being reconfigured almost before our eyes in the context of the pandemic. And in saying that, I don't mean to minimize the way in which the failure of business as usual was not harmful, for indeed it has been in an ongoing way. But I also want to suggest that the way that societies have been able to pivot when they're prompted to do so means that the system is pliable and it can be reinvented, it can be commoned. So from our Australian colleague, Miriam Williams, we learned about a whole ecosystem of food distribution networks operating in cities like Sydney. They were able to coordinate efforts to expand the use of emergency food provisioning in relation to populations that were made newly vulnerable, from the huge numbers of people who became unemployed to the tens of thousands of stranded international students. From colleague Graydon Dipros in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we learned about the state-supported New Zealand National Food Network that coordinated a similar response on a national scale, redirecting food made surplus that used to go to hotel and leisure industries, and that now were being put to people in places that could make use of it. In India, we drew on keen insights from our colleague, Bhavya Chitranshi, who's focusing on Eka Narya Sangatan, ENS, an organization that she helped co-found a dozen years ago. It's a single women's collective in Odisha, India. As the previous speaker was saying, and what Bhavya emphasizes is that cultural revaluations of food are crucial to subsistence practices of agriculture, that there's a process of revalorization or even a making sacred of food that's central to the development of a different food culture. So these disparate and particular circumstances, the diverse forms in which food systems can be commoned, suggest that there's much that we could learn from one another, and that commoning itself, as we're framing it here, represents a different historical trajectory that involves us in a reciprocal relationship with a more than human world, one that's sustained by culture, art, and even commerce, and that it can be further enabled by governments and the development of effective infrastructure to common our food security. But it requires us, I think, to think in relation to a much longer time scale, to think in relation to what Brand referred to over more than a decade ago as the moment of the long now, just the kind of thinking we need to deal with climate change while this pandemic is going on and afterwards. And now I'll hand things over to my colleague Inka.
Great. Thank you, Stefan, for providing the context for our work and an overview of the other case studies. So yes, my name is Inka Santala, and I'm one of the co-authors of this paper. As my own background, I'm originally from Finland, where I did my bachelor and master thesis in geography, focusing mainly on urban and future studies at the time, before moving to do my PhD here in Australia in 2017. Thus, I would like to also acknowledge that I'm currently living and working in the lands of Darawal people, who remain the traditional custodians of the area that we now call Woolongong. So while visiting this beautiful piece of country, I've had the privilege to explore and reimagine the post-COVID food futures together with other members of the Community Economies Research Network, as Stefan mentioned, not only from Australia, but also New Zealand and India, and of course my own home country, Finland. And that is the case study site to which I would like to draw your attention next. With another Finnish CERN member, Teppo Eskainen, our task was to consider how might we approach and think of commoning food within and beyond the sort of welfare state setting. So Stephen, if you can jump into the second slide. The other slide. Thank you. So yeah, as some of you might know, as a Nordic nation with an extensive government subsidies and a service provision, Finland is generally considered to be a relatively stable and food secure welfare state within the European Union. However, since the early onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the unfolding health and economic crisis has revealed some of the structural weaknesses of the country's food production and distribution systems. First of all, the world was faced with the first lockdown and quarantine period in March 2020. It seriously halted and disrupted the surplus food distribution on which many of the underprivileged people left out of the welfare system are counting on. And the fact is that since the national recession in 1990s, Finland has been heavily dependent on the food aid distributed by not-for-profit organizations. So when COVID-19 restrictions were suddenly established, created this an enormous pressure for the already trained charity organizations, which had very limited capacity to respond to the rapidly growing demand. Yet, despite revealing these vulnerabilities of the food distribution, relying on non-governmental actors, what also emerged through the lockdown period was a growing urge to donate and volunteer to help others in the need. As seen in the pictures on the slide, people with no previous experience on volunteering began delivering food bags to their neighbors and sharing essential produce to new mutual aid networks. Also, as the borders were closed, preventing import and the entry of seasonal workers, led this to a growing interest on the locally grown food, highlighting the importance of self-sufficiency and small-scale agriculture in both rural and urban areas. And here, Stephen, you can change the next slide. Thanks. So while Finland and other nations also have long traditions of food foraging and an appreciation of the locally grown produce, have these become increasingly outsourced and commercialized in previous decades, as mentioned by the other panelists as well. Thus, what the early response to the global pandemic highlighted was the possibility and call for more participatory, localized and inclusive food systems, a form of commoning in which food is positioned not only a commodity and eventually waste, but also a common responsibility as well as an entitlement. However, this commoning of food within and despite the structures of a welfare state is not something that we should only sort to in the case of emergency or crisis. Rather, as we highlighted in the paper and Stefan also earlier, this commoning requires a new way of thinking food systems through time and approaching them from a more intergenerational perspective, considering the past as well as the potential futures to come in order to build more diverse and distributed food systems that sustain us all. So you can change the next slide, thanks. So another activity we started during the first lockdown that also inspired the creation of this paper was a future scenario exercise, as this connects also a bit with the Ruchi's talk as well on the potential two futures ahead. Because what we started here was considering the potential path-dependent responses to the emerging pandemic, such as continuing to rely on charity organizations for the distribution of food aid, providing new tax reliefs to boost existing businesses, and potentially lowering food prices and supporting the import of products from overseas, slowly commercializing local food initiatives, most likely increasing the subsidies for dairy and meat producers. And what we saw these actions might do was only to fuel the currently inequitable and destructive food system, eventually escalating the unfolding climate crisis. So what we started to think was ways that food commons are sustained through time. How might we recognize and uphold more just and sustainable food systems during and post-pandemic in ways that would enable tackling the climate crisis? And what we did was, from that collective vision, began building a politics of possibility towards the present day. What we thought we would like to see in the future were more climate-friendly agriculture programs and support for organic farmers, direction of subsidies to more social enterprises as well as the local food initiatives, establishing regulation that prevents and utilizes the surplus food, introducing taxations that would be more progressive to balance growing income inequalities. And this might all start with standardizing the fair food distribution. Of course, this is only an imaginary scenario exercise, but what it does, it helps us to see ways we might begin to expand the commoning capacity, understanding that managing the food systems is not only a linear process towards present day ambitions, but an ongoing performance in which we need to regard both past and potential future realities. Because if it turns out, as it seems, that COVID-19 is just the beginning of the food crisis that will be deepened by ongoing climate change, it remains necessary to expand the commoning of food systems, not only locally in place, but broadening to the planetary scale, considering we are all sustained by the same biosystem. So that's our talk, and I open the floor, I guess, next for questions and discussion.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Inka, for this very thrilling presentations. I think, well, first of all, you gave essence and, the concrete actualization of what Ruchi said at the beginning, that the web of life is a food web, not only because you managed to respond to the needs, to the living needs of those that were affected by the pandemic in so many ways. For example, unemployment, but also because you use this opportunity to regenerate and to reinvigorate lines of food production that were, there and that are now out of which you have created, in a way, the politics of possibilities. I very much appreciate also this idea of not keeping happy with just the practice, but the good practice is not enough. It has to be translated into some sort of policy lines, taxation, regulation, standardization of the good food and the good way of producing food. I think it's very, very important. I mean, I think I interpret Ruchi, Shroff, and Hernando's, Salcedo's point of view that you should be here in Rome next week to be in charge of the Food System Summit, instead of having Agnes Kalibata, who is the president of the African Revolution, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, as the rapporteur of the Secretary General of the UN to project the future food systems after the pandemic. So I think there should be a major shift in responsibilities on who is guiding the ball, who is guiding the game for the future. So thank you very, very much for this brilliant presentation, and thank you all for the brilliant presentations that you made. It's a really very coherent mosaic a system that needs a change for this the moment of the long changes, the long now, as Stephen put it. This is the moment, this is the now, the urgency of the now that we all need to feel. So I have seen that there may be interventions, that there may be comments, questions to our panelists. We have a bit of time to have a first round of questions, and then a second round for the panelists also to respond to the observations, the comments that have been that are being made. Allow me just to highlight one thing, Stephen. You talk about the community economies, and you have represented these community economies with a bottom-up approach. It's interesting because the international initiative for the distribution of vaccines, COVID vaccines in the world, COVAX, calls the countries and the communities economies, but in the kind of neoliberal sense. So this is really an amazing way of you using the word economies in the original sense, the management of the house, the management of the system that we have been given. And so I really appreciate this thing. So please, yes, if you have any questions, I don't see them. Except for so I will start then with a question to the panelists. In view of what you have told us, and the analysis, the research that you are doing, what is, and I would actually start from Stephen and Inka, how do you see 1.5 years after the pandemic, how do you see things evolving in this practice of relying of localized and inclusive food systems, especially in light of the work that you have analyzed and set in place, also participating in setting in place? How are things evolving in Finland, in India, and in Australia and New Zealand 1.5 years after the pandemic? Has there been an enhanced and participatory political discourse around these practices? And are there any other examples that can be brought from the other speakers? I think of Colombia or India. Or...
Okay. Well, Stephen, you can go.
Please, Stephen, please.
That's a great question, and I really wish we had all of our co-authors here with us, because I'm sure they could provide us with a lot more insights.
We can have another webinar. We can have another webinar.
What comes to mind for me, anyways, is developments in New Zealand, Aotearoa, that I hear about from my colleague Braden and another colleague of mine, which is about a kind of deepening partnership between New Zealand's government under Jacinda and the Maori iwi in both the North and South Islands. That this has been a kind of context for really thinking about notions of partnership and what food security means and what care for country means in that particular setting. I guess the discourse has been really proceeding in a bicultural context, right, which is part of New Zealand's law. And I think I can see something similar in Australia happening right now in the larger context of land management. So for example, and I think this is really not coming out of the pandemic, but that experience of the landscape fire that we seem to have forgotten about in 2019 and into 2020, when almost the entire country was on fire for months at a time. And a lot of people are saying that sort of the land management strategies that use different kinds of approaches to control burns that really emphasize biodiversity. That should be, front and center. So there's been the local government near us has actually embraced the concept of a progressive concept of planetary health, and is now working with the local Aboriginal community to see what that might actually look like in practice. So I think that's a larger setting in which we might then begin to think about food security.
Thank you, Stephen. I also would like to ask Maria Cristina Rulli, and if I know that your article has created the methodology to look at the mapping of risks of zoonotic events has created some attention from some of the governments, some entities that have called on you to basically send a sign of alert, but also understand how they can be better at the land management issue that Stephen was now talking about, and how they can avoid a certain overexploitation of land. I mean, what has been in your research work? How have you interacted also with the authorities, the forest authorities, for example, or agricultural entities that are under such a heavy pressure?
Well, good afternoon at first. Well, at the moment of when we wrote the paper, unfortunately, we did not interact with the forest people, with government people, but now we do that because some governments ask us to explain better the potential of our research. And so now it's probably our analysis could have a momentum to be applied. What we basically did was to gather and then to analyze a very detailed maps, and we could have these maps thanks to government too. But to be honest, at the moment of when we made the analysis of the paper, we did not have interaction with government.
Thank you, Maria Cristina. So this is to be developed, because as Stephen and Inka tell us, we really need to politicize then the work that is being, the research that we do. There are some questions coming here. I can see one from Pradeep. Did you see an increased use of wild edibles after pandemic in any of the studies? This is the first question. I don't know who wants to take this. I'll take a couple of them. There is a second question from Barbara Heinzer. What experiments have any of the panelists seen to start to change the economic incentives to encourage better land management? So have you seen any policies directed at incentivizing better land management? And I'll take a third one. Are there suggested actions from Grove? Are there suggested actions, intervention points during the pre-food summit next week? Something Ruchi is doing that could you support? So this we will talk, but let's go back to Pratik's question about the potential increase use of wild edibles after the pandemic, and the question of the incentives to encourage better land management. Who wants to answer the first question from Pradeep? Maybe Ruchi or Hernando? Yes, Hernando, please, you have the floor.
Gracias. Sí, la pregunta refleja primero la idea de que la preponderancia de los perfiles de los patrones alimentarios es industrial, porque a lo que son alimentos reales los llamamos comestibles salvajes. Entonces, lo que hemos visto en América Latina, en países como Colombia, es que precisamente a raíz de la pandemia, la capacidad colectiva de los productores locales de alimentos reales, que no son comestibles industriales, que no son comestibles ultraprocesados, ha permitido cohesionar formas de acceso a estos alimentos reales, y que esto ha empoderado a los grupos y a las poblaciones para lograr tener una alimentación diferente. Es una paradoja, pero esto se ha visto también en países como Ecuador, no solamente en Colombia. Entonces, es importante resaltarlo y recordar con ello lo que dije al iniciar mi intervención, y es que la industria de comestibles ultraprocesados, que son comestibles, no alimentos, es precisamente la que ha implicado este patrón alimentario corporativo, y que la pandemia ha mostrado que este también determina la manera como enfermamos, y que una salida es ahora el acceso a productores locales de alimentos reales y a la agroecología. Entonces es un fenómeno colectivo que se visibiliza a partir de la pandemia en lugares como América Latina.
Gracias, Hernando. Thank you very much. Ruchi, do you want to respond also?
Thanks, Nicoletta. Yeah, just to add to what already Stephen, Inka, and Hernando were also saying, yes, on one side, the pandemic has also exposed the precariousness of the industrial food system. If you see, India or many parts of the world, the cash crop farmers are dependent on exports, and the system's completely broken down. But on the other hand, there were many cases, and to Pradeep's question, I remember reading about the Sundarbans in Bengal and farmers which grow ecologically diverse plants were not worried for food security. They were not able to sell crops out, but their fields were filled with potatoes, with fruits, and there was, and I remember reading cases about an increase in the consumption of wild edible plants. So yes, on the other side, and then if you look at same ecological local systems, there was an explosion of community supported farms sales, whether in Italy or even in the US, supplementing empty grocery stores, and an increase in the resurgence of chinampa farming, for example, in Mexico City, as globalized food chains collapsed. So this is the evidence that the pandemic gave of the resilience of local ecological food systems. In terms of, because I'm just because being involved here in Italy, I think one very interesting work is also happening at local and regional levels, at municipality levels. For example, in Italy, there is of movements called biodistretti, which I find quite fascinating. The work that is happening at the community level, which is not just led by one actor of the food system, be it the food producer or the state or the government, but multiple actors coming together to have a vision of what biodistrict or ecological district should look like, but also supported by regional legislation to support this ecological rural things. So there are some interesting work happening. We are also working with some of them on the ground here, but I think there is also interesting policy work happening at the local and regional level. Yeah, this was just to add.
Thank you, Ruchi. As far as the work that Stephen and Inka have been doing, is there, because you are interacting also with the policymakers, are you seeing any economic incentives to encourage a better land management and therefore food production in the areas of your work?
Oh, well, yeah, I can answer that probably. Like, yeah, we
Inka,
haven't
yes.
really been so much engaging with the policymakers, more like featuring so far with the through the research team in different locations, but we hope to probably extend these discussions and would invite the policymakers to come involved and have these discussions. But I see in Finland at least there's been through that early onset, the focus has been more towards really taking on board the green growth and developing more participatory and collective ways how to manage. And there has been an encouragement for more localized systems. So I feel there is a growing encouragement for more collective land management and those initiatives, but it is a work in progress, and there's like lots of promises and strategy like ambitions put into a vision, but we'll see what comes to actual concrete in the end.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if Stephen has anything to add or.
Probably nothing that would really come from my own research, but I just the context of the land that we're on right now, certainly the bigger existential issue here is around water use to grow things like cotton, which is just manifestly, it's lunacy in the Australian context. So one of the things I mentioned Bruce Pascoe's work, there is a kind of broader movement to begin to think about what an appropriate agriculture would look like in the Australian context, and by extension, what could we learn from the peoples who have occupied this continent for upwards of 80,000 years. And that's part of Pascoe's project, is to recover that. And then there are younger generations of Aboriginal scholars, and I'm thinking of Tyson Yunkapatura in particular, who just wrote a book called Sand Talk, that again begins to think about Aboriginal food cultures and the way that they might shape a different approach to land management fundamentally in this society. That's a long game politics, though. I would imagine that would take a couple of generations to really take hold. But I don't know, I feel like things are rather bleak in the Australian continent when we're thinking about early onset impacts of climate change. Might force the issue.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you also for, I forgot it earlier, you mentioned particularly this, your being in, you know, your connection with the Aboriginal land, the Aboriginal culture, the Aboriginal agriculture. It was, I think, Naomi Klein who wrote a few years back that the only option for, you know, survival on this planet is that actually we get back to these indigenous communities and the native communities and understand how they do it, how they have always managed it in order to re-establish the relationship and the capacity of the conservation and regeneration that Ruchi was mentioning at the beginning, of communities being custodians, not just farmers, but communities and groups being the custodians of nature. And I think this is a very interesting point that one of our commenters made. What we are really talking about is the notion of development. You know, the fact that we have universalized Western thinking about development, and now we assume that that is the one development, the one route, the one size fits all. And I think it's really a question of the right to development. I just would like to throw this ball to you speakers and see how you react to. Maybe not all of you are aware that less than a month ago, a treaty on the right to development was delivered at the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. And therefore, this is a new pathway for diplomatic negotiation, totally not considered by the WHO, the UN, or other fora where health is just seen in isolation. But what is really at stake at the moment is the right to development and the self-determination the development that people want to create. So I just, I don't know if you want to comment on this. This was one of the questions of the considerations made by our participants. Who wants to take the floor? Maybe even from the Milan team that actually observed, you know, also some of the pathways that are being now embraced to sort of save the climate or save nature, save the environment, which are not necessarily the best ones, although they are claimed to be the best ones. I just leave it from your different perspectives.
Yes. So, well, yeah, from our perspective, yeah, the risk factors we've seen in the analysis are all factors that are in some ways related to the to what we are used to as a traditional definition of development, which is strictly associated to increased consumption of resources and preconception that these resources are available, but this may not hold. So indeed, the redefinition of development passes through the concept of sustainability and the redefinition of the concept of sustainability itself. So we need to change our view of development in a more holistic sense, in the sense that it is not just our development, but it's the development of our relation with the environment, which is what provides us with the means for development itself. It's my opinion on that. You want to add something?
Thank you, Nicholas. Other comments coming from the speakers? Hernando, please.
Sí, quisiera decir que dentro de esa idea de derecho al desarrollo, hay que cuestionar también la noción misma de desarrollo como tal y pensar de pronto en formas de gobernanza policéntricas que estén basadas en la equidad y la alimentación como bien común es un punto de partida para ello. Y esa es una manera de reinterpretar esa adopción en el discurso del desarrollo de metas que tienen los objetivos de las comunidades cuando quieren trabajar en los bienes comunes alimentarios. Entonces, es como dar la vuelta a esa noción de desarrollo para hablar de esa gobernanza policéntrica en torno a lo alimentario.
¿Qué quiere decir hablar de las community economies? Talking about community economies as a concept, yes. Thank you, Hernando. Here, I see more questions here. Is there any specific non-forest product that is valuable to most developing countries that could be domesticated elsewhere? I'm not sure that I understand the question. And then there is another one from Pradeep. In India, there were some cases of COVID-19 in lions in Hyderabad Zoo. Were there any cases of COVID-19 reported in any other wildlife species in any country? Oh, wow, this is difficult to tell. Anyone who wants to take these questions on board? Difficult questions, actually, because we, I think, are working in other arenas. Here, of course, there's Mauro Verra that is reminding us of the need to accelerate consciousness in the different countries, and starting from Europe, where all these questions, these issues are, maybe they were kind of hinted at and they were discussed last year, but they are sort of disappearing a little bit. And of course, yes, what Inka, especially what Inka was saying, it's projecting into a dream future, or projecting into the utopia that is the non yet that we want to see for the future. So we really need to be extremely ambitious and project now what we want to see. No, I don't have any answers for these questions. I don't know if you want to make, let's make a final round. I'll start from Ruchi. I'm more on the kind of a positive side, just a positive message, because of course, as Nicholas was portraying, this continuous abuse of the land, of the territory is ongoing, but still we really need also to project the future we want to see. Ruchi, just to conclude.
Sorry, my 2-year-old is up.
Wonderful. I mean, the fact that you have a 2-year-old up, the other one with the 3-year-old sleeping, rightly enough. I mean, this is in itself already the answer, but we do. Go ahead.
No, I think this is the in a sense the current pandemic is giving us the message that we either change, not just make that look at the crisis, the multiple crises and the interrelationships between them, and we have the answer to follow the ecological path, which is already being done by communities worldwide. So I think it is giving us a message to change that and to that path. Otherwise, for our 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, it's going to be a much more. I mean, we have to for them. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ruchi. Thank you, Hernando.
Gracias. Sí, pienso que hay que decir que definitivamente en este contexto de sindemia, en donde hay una convergencia de factores que están expresándose a través de lo que está ocurriendo en la salud humana y planetaria, es necesario reformular la acción colectiva, replanteando los roles de gobernanza, los roles de género, y una salida a esta fase tardía del capitalismo para que construyamos procesos alimentarios de regeneración hacia bienes comunes, y pienso que es el momento y ya no hay más tiempo.
Yes, time is up, time is almost over. Therefore, it's the now that we have to really cross with full consciousness. Maria Cristina and Nicholas.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, the source for the positive message comes from the very same things that lead us to the most catastrophic statements we make. So the fact that different aspects of our interactions with the environment are causing different types of problems is also the key to understand that if we engage into an holistic approach, if we understand this, we can act on different sectors at the same time and have positive outcomes. We can revert negative trends also on sectors that we are not actually acting on. So as we generated negative externalities, we can generate positive ones if we start to understand this.
Yes, I like that. Negative externalities are not a destiny, so we can actually, reverse those into positive ones. And Stephen, I think I really would like you to now just give us a bit of a positive message on the food futures that are common futures.
Yeah, sure. I just want to say thanks to my fellow panelists for some really brilliant and insightful talks. And this was such a great forum. I'm also realizing that it's 3 in the morning in New Zealand, so I could have said a lot more since they won't be awake to hear it. But, one of the New Zealand sociologist, John Law, talked about development as the production of the one world. And I think that we're at the end of that one world. And so whatever comes afterwards is in that context of the pluriverse, right? The many worlds in the one world. And that's, Arturo Escobar, Punchim and Hernando is someone who taught me about that. I had the opportunity to work with him, and it's really in that context of thinking about cultural continuity as a process of autonomous design that includes food systems but goes well beyond that. To my mind, that means that we've got a wealth of examples to learn from about how to do things differently, how to do things in place, and that part of accommodating myself as a newcomer to this country, as an American living in Australia, is to really, again, to begin to think about what a relationship to place means. And then I'm invited to care for country. I've been told that. And I want to take that seriously. And I hope that other people do too, wherever they are.
These are very important words, Stephen. Thank you very, very much. Inka.
Yeah, so I might just add a little bit to that, saying like building more like the hopeful future. So it doesn't mean reinventing everything or reinventing the wheel, but also like just recognizing and revaluing of what's already out there. So what localized, what resourceful ways people are already engaging in, and the little initiatives and the localized works that people are already expressing. So it's kind of amplifying and recognizing that and learning to ways to upscale that, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Inka. I think something that Stephen said earlier on is really important. We are talking about biodiversity today as the vaccine. That's for nature, but that's also for knowledge. And I believe something that he said earlier, that there are so many community-based responses under our eyes that have been, pursued, they have been enacted, but we have been trained to sort of ignore them. And that is unfortunately the elimination of the biodiversity that contains a lot of innovation already, whereas a certain type of innovation is being marketed. That's the kind of the multi-stakeholder model that keeps talking about innovation, which is indeed a repetition of the same, of new ways to do it exactly the same, which is the destruction of the planet, and use this, this growth without limitless growth, this linear trend to consume everything. And therefore, I think really the biodiversity, just as the health crisis of mankind is the health crisis of the planet, I think that the biodiversity of the planet is also the human biodiversity of knowledges, of practices that we already have, that we have had for such a long time, and Aboriginal communities, populations that are in harmony with nature are in many ways our solution. Of course, I think 1.5 years also to kind of closing remarks, 1.5 years after the beginning of this first pandemic, likely to be the one world war, the one world narrative, the one development solution is coming to an end. I once again reiterate what Stephen was saying. I think we are in this interregnum now. No? We are really still at the beginning of this pandemic, because we are still maybe at the end of the beginning. It's the end of the first phase, but certainly, whereas the international community is talking about, pandemic treaties for pandemic responses of the future, almost as if the current one were gone, were over. We are still pretty much in the pandemic. And certainly in the same issue of development, I was referring to COVID-19 as our kind of most rational, however ferocious pedagogue, a vital pedagogue, in fact, because what COVID-19 is telling us is that if we continue in the models that we have adopted over the last four decades mostly, if we continue to expand our presence in territories that are inhabited by other neighbors, by our neighbors of the condominium, these neighbors come back to us. They will, you know, they are coming basically to us. They come into our bodies. And so this is really what COVID-19 tells us. And it also, I think it's very symbolic, very powerful, the fact that COVID-19 attacks our respiratory tract, just to remind us all that we were living in a world without breath already. So we really have a symbolic and almost an epiphany of what we were not able to see at the beginning of this millennium with the attack on the Twin Towers 20 years ago. You know, we will be kind of making memory of what happened 20 years ago with the attacks on the Twin Towers. With the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, we went back to the usual business. Now with the respiratory tract that is continuously attacked with the new variants, it will not be with the vaccines that we solve the problem, that we get, you know, the panacea for all this crisis will not be the vaccines. So I really hope that collectively, as a research community, as an activist community, we can also expand and densify the messages that have been conveyed today, that really we need more vaccines and that we need other vaccines to overcome the crisis that we are in for the future. Otherwise, we will continue not to understand what the lessons of COVID are. I wish to thank you all. I really wish to thank Ruchi Shroff from Navdanya International. I wish to thank Hernando Salcedo from FIAN Colombia. I wish to thank Nicolas Galli and Maria Cristina Rulli from the Politecnico of Milan, and Stephen Healy from Australia, very much in the night now, and Inka for the very brilliant presentations that you have shared with us, also in this kind of light of hope that we can make the difference. We will have to make the difference. Of course, I also want to thank those that prepared this webinar. I wish to thank Blanca and Maria Jose, our translators, our interpreters that allowed us all to interact in more languages. And of course, this webinar has been recorded. I will definitely ask on all of you to, you know, replicate and reuse this webinar in your respective communities for passing on and densifying and expanding the word that the world needs other vaccines to overcome the crisis. Thank you very much to all of you for making it and for the work you are doing that is so precious for the future commons, that the healthy commons that we want to see. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.